People need ordering principles. 12 rules.
Hello, welcome to 12 Rules for What? My name is Sam. As ever, I'm joined by
Alex.
And we are extremely happy to be here with the very long overdue guest, Shane Burley, who is the author of 2 books about anti-fascism. Actually, it's suggested somewhere in the text that he's the author of 3 books about anti-fascism, but I know 2 of them. The one we're talking about today is Why We Fight, essays on fascism, resistance, and surviving the apocalypse, which is out now in the UK, and I think for AK Press, and has been out in America for some time. And back in 2017, he also wrote Fascism Today, What It Is and How to End It, which is also out from AK Press. He's written from NBC News, Jacobin, The Baffler, Al Jazeera, and a bunch of other places, including this one here I can't pronounce, which I think is called Proteon. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is just to introduce yourself kind of beyond this slightly formal academic bio that I just given. What would you say to listeners about yourself that goes beyond this kind of formal setup that tells us something about what it is you're trying to do? Although I imagine that your name is familiar to the majority of people who are listening.
You know, that's so interesting. No one's ever asked me to describe myself beyond the bio. So I don't know who I am. I've been lost in my professional life. Well, I guess I'm based out here in Portland, both a writer involved in social movements for years and years, and started being concerned about the far right before the large wave of the alt-right, so probably about 2010, 2011, when Richard Spencer and other people started to appear on the scene. And sort of started writing, chronicling that, and then I just kind of picked up the wave when it came. But also part of mutual aid movements, labor, solidarity networks, and housing movements. And so the new book is thinking about both those things together, kind of a sense of the apocalypse, a sense of depression, that kind of a cultural malaise, but also why I am not depressed about it amidst the kind of ongoing crisis that will only probably get more severe in the coming years.
You're not depressed?
I'm less depressed. I am less depressed than common sense would dictate I should be.
It's very interesting. It's a very interesting kind of part of a bio that you are on average less depressed than perhaps you ought to be. It's a very good character trait. I wish I also had that. So both the books are obviously about fascism. You paint fascism very broadly, and I'm not going to kind of take you to task for this. In the book we just wrote, we say that fascism has been fundamentally kind of misidentified as for the wrong thing, and yet neither of us are academics. Yes, fascism is a slur, but also slurs sometimes are quite useful. So I think this is the way in which I understand your use of the word fascism, but give us a sense of what it is you're describing when you use that term.
Yeah, it's interesting how I expected to get taken to task by people when the first book came out, and I was not. And I always thought that was surprising because I do use an incredibly broad definition. I remember, I think it was Arun Gupta, we were having a party after my first book event, was like, your definition of fascism, you're just talking about reactionaries. And I was like, exactly. I'm saying that all reactionaries are fascists. And he's like, what? That's fucking wild. What? That's way too broad. But what I'm actually saying is that what I would actually consider the pure correct right-wing position is embodied by a fascist politic. And it's one that I think is trans-historical to a point, meaning that fascism is the modern incarnation of a deeper philosophical impulse that makes up the right. And so when we call it fascism, we're actually talking about a uniquely modern phenomenon that's kind of at war with the Enlightenment values, which do lead towards the left, right? Even if we're talking about like Beltway conservatives, they're obviously very right-wing, but when we're talking about in a broader sense, they're not necessarily against the basic fundamental, well, it's debatable, but they at least publicly argue themselves not to be, enemies of the fundamental principles of democracy, or at least like legal equalities or something like that. So fascists take the implicit inequality and make it explicit. And so it's a much more broad category. I talk about centralized identity and inequality as tent poles, but then we can also add in like a revolutionary character, an essentialization of violence. There's a few other kind of principles that I think make up the whole picture. But what's really important about this is that we can't reduce fascism to some of the principles by which it is usually reduced to. So authoritarianism on the one hand, there's all types of authoritarians, and authoritarians come in a whole number of packages. So I think that's not a good baseline. Totalitarianism, on the other hand, is something that I don't know if is even functionally possible in the way that people use it. So I don't think that's a really good marker. Fascist governments were primitive states. They were nothing compared to like the U.S. government. Take something like Nazi Germany, simply was not capable of the kinds of things that like the U.S. CIA was capable of. So it's hard to actually say, well, that's the totalitarian government compared to what? Compared to modern like Western democracies or imperial nations. So that's not a good marker. Nationalism is, again, also not a good marker because we're not always talking about nations. We're talking about other types of identity in some cases. I mean, where does the men's rights movement fit if we're talking about nationalism as opposed as in coordinated nation states, or people, ethnic groups without states, or nationalisms that take a left character? How do they play with it? So I actually think like even saying nationalism is sometimes problematic because it leaves some things out. So we use this intentionally broad definition to look at a trend, and in doing so, we start to see what things have in common with each other, I think. So what, for example, does the men's rights movement, the alt-right, have in common with paleoconservatism, have in common with Ulster loyalists in Northern Ireland, have in common with the BJP in India, have in common with Bolsonaro, elements of Bolsonaro's movement? Is there a commonality there? And if there is a commonality, then we're actually talking about something much more complicated and persistent. And I think it actually helps to define our politics in the inverse for that. This runs directly counter to a number of people. So Dave Renton did another blurb for your book, right? I don't think he would agree with me on this. I interviewed David very recently. We didn't talk about this. We talked about things we agree with, but I'm assuming, given like his writings, his discussion on post-fascism, and his dislike of like Roger Griffin and other people, he probably would disagree on those sorts of points. It's totally fair disagreement. But I am a little bit more swayed by the Roger Griffin type new consensus approach with that really broad ideational definition of fascism.
Yeah, I think overall in that kind of debate, I do also side more with David Renton and what I see as that kind of material kind of grounding. But I do think there's a space for Roger Griffin. I also think it's an absolutely baller move on the part of Roger Griffin in the 1990s to be like, this is the new consensus. The book that I have written, it is the only one.
I think he was correct. But there is, I think, room for both in a way. Like, like I just got a quote from Renton for an article I'm doing on the Israeli far right, and his point that he writes about the mobilization of the far right to the center right, basically the ability to move the center right to the far right. It's particularly true in Israel, where far right-wing parties are able to move Likud by basically forcing coalition governments, but also moving the public. That being said, those far-right parties are so clearly within the new consensus definition of fascism that it's so undebatable. So the process, I think, is described well by Renton. The definitional character, though, I think is taken up by George Moss and Roger Griffin and others. And it actually characterizes the kind of ethnic politics of Shaz or Israel Beitana or something like that.
I mean, I think now, in this moment specifically, after Trump and after all that's happened, and with the kind of breaking down between the non-fascist conservative wing and the fascist part of the right, we're starting to see things kind of merge together and get all very indistinct and are kind of unclear. I think the kind of a broader definition is probably more applicable in this moment.
I think what Renton and others are doing is actually centering violence and revolution, like open revolution, as the deciding factor in a fascist movement. And there's a reason to do this. A lot of people do this. And I explicitly don't do this because there are fascist movements that I think are unquestionably fascist that are so metapolitical that they could never even engage in the kind of discourse that those folks are defining as fascism. So, if we look at like the pre-2014, pre-2015 alt-right that was, basically having conferences and trying to influence like art and things like that, it was clearly a fascist movement. There's really no question about it, but they weren't capable or even publicly advocating or probably even internally advocating for the kind of violence that you associate with a fascist movement. Instead, they're like a cultural movement. So how do you rope those people in when you use public displays of violence, or the being supra democratic, or being exceptionally anti-democratic or something like that? How could you actually rope them in? And so I think it's easier to actually think of it in ideational terms, basically to think about it as ideologies, and to think about the other practical politics as strategic.
You mentioned that you started following fascism, far right movements, kind of quite early on in the kind of cycle of the alt-right. What point did you feel that people started to take an interest in this as a problem? Was it with the rise of Trump specifically, or was it an earlier point than that?
It was actually an earlier point. It was slightly earlier. It was with hashtag #Cuckservative that trended really big, and that came out of the Right Stuff and the Daily Show podcast networks in the U.S. So this was at the time, let's say 2014, the alt-right had a peak and a trough. It kind of had come and it was starting to go, and Richard Spencer was rebranding himself using identitarian language, like bloc identitaire and stuff, and was not using the term alternative right anymore, really. But then the second generation, like alt-right 2.0, picked up on the alt-right language, were using it, and they started to merge with Spencer, and they were pushing like trolling and hashtags and things as like the new methodology of the alt-right. And so hashtag #Cuckservative came, and that was a really big deal. That got a bunch of news stories. Directly after that, they trended hashtag what is alt-right and hashtag alt-right. And so that was actually really where it wasn't alt-right, it was alternative right. The term alt-right probably wouldn't have been very heavily used. So that's about 2015, before Trump. So those people were doing podcasts about the Trump phenomenon that were already getting attention. So it was slightly before that. That being said, I mean, I remember pitching an article in 2014 to a publication who will remain nameless, but they were like, Shane, none of these people will ever be a threat to anyone. They are totally meaningless. Go focus on the police or something. And so, yeah, I mean, like, people had no conception of this. No, I mean, to say people had no conception of it is almost to give them a pass. There was a complete and total consensus that this would never, ever happen. You know, like that we were so beyond the capacity to have a far right-wing breakdown of the system that it was more than navel-gazing to even discuss it. It was like ideological chicanery or something. So yeah, no, people did not take this seriously whatsoever.
You mentioned that the response of the publication was to go and write about the police. And I wanted to kind of ask you about whether or not you think that the term fascism can include things that are operate inside a broadly liberal order. Natasha Lennard, in the introduction to your book, uses a term also that I wanted to kind of ask about, which is racial capitalism. This is a very interesting term because capitalism has been racial from the beginning. But I was also kind of wondering, what do you make of this term, and what do you think is the connection of this term to fascism? Is fascism a way of describing the racist authoritarian impulses that exist within liberal society? How do you see these two things as being related?
You know, I've been thinking about Israel a lot because I've been writing about Israel, and I'm sitting with this stack of books on the Israeli right next to me. And one of the points that's made is that the current problem in Israel is sort of the triumph of revisionist Zionism, which was not necessarily a fascist movement itself, but it had a fascist wing, it was basically attached to, because of the ideological nationalism, the ethnic politics, all those sorts of things. You could not do without the fascist wing. It was always implicit to it. But then I think an even deeper argument would be made that you really can't have an ethnic politics that's ever a democracy. It's simply not a democratic notion. Ethnostates, even of the most leftist variety, with the IRA or something like that, like there's really no way of developing a liberatory movement that can really bear this out. And instead, actually, it creates a situation in which the logical conclusion of the social trajectory is on the right. So There's a number of writers that would talk about like the why labor Zionism gave way to revisionist Zionism because they capitulated with ethnic politics from the beginning. They talked about class. They were a class movement, but they gave in to ethnic politics. And so the underlying lesson there, at least for me, is that there is no left nationalism. But whether or not you sympathize with liberation movements, that's a different story. But like a true left nationalism is not possible. I think that in the same way, the underlying values, the underlying conditions of these kind of liberal democratic societies is so fundamentally unequal that fascism is its logical conclusion. There's really no way to build a complex set of identities on racial inequality, to build up economic systems on colonialism, exploitation, and slavery, and not have that be the underlying logic of the system. In a weird way, fascists get society in a way that liberals don't. They get that there's stratification. They get that that's actually not natural in the biological or ephemeral spiritual sense, but it's natural to the social scene to have forced stratification. And racial capitalism, like you said, is the only capitalism that exists. It's almost like we don't need the racial part in that phrase because the capitalism does it just fine. And so what fascist movies do is they take the implicit and make it explicit. I'm blanking on who it was. Maybe it was Foucault that said that fascism is basically colonialism turned back on who was it?
Césaire, yeah.
Right. Turned back on the European mainland. So it is the implicit underlying structures of the capitalist economy and the modern nation state system then turned back on itself. It's actually the full realization of what the underlying contradictions are. So I think that this gets back to if there's a revolutionary component to anti-fascism or if it's just about fixing the errors that occur, like there's only one option to really confront fascist insurgency, which is to take to task the very foundations of these societies and uproot them and uproot those problems. And that's not an easy thing because there's no actual example of this happening in history. We do not have a revolution like none other. We actually have a history of revolutions like all others, which have failed to meet full revolutionary and utopian goals. Instead, they just kind of capitulate and hope for something better. But that's one of the problems here is that we have a long legacy of failed attempts at full liberation and then instead maintain these hierarchies. And so that's the fundamental, I think, cooperation that happens between liberal society and fascism.
So I have two questions, and not quite sure which one to ask first. So the first one I think is about something else that liberals are really not very good at dealing with in politics, which is apocalypticism. You mentioned Fromm, who is of course not a fascist in any sense at all, who has a kind of strain of apocalypticism in his thought, and there's also mentions of Walter Benjamin, who of course has a kind of apocalypticism of his own, and perhaps you could say the same for other members of the Frankfurt School. So the question is, like, what is the proper political use of apocalypticism? What use could this idea be put to, and how can we kind of wrestle it back from fascism? Could it be used by the left? Could it be wielded by the left?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the right uses apocalypticism because they are correct, because this is an apocalypse, and we are living in an absolute crisis. This is one of the realities of it. This sort of compulsive hopefulness that you get from the liberal left is one based on a faith in the system of reforms, one which is absolutely incapable of dealing with ecological and economic and social crisis, right? There's absolutely no way that you can stop the wave of mass killings with gun control measures. There's no way you can stop the wave of police murders by creating, citizen review boards. There's no way you're going to stop like the absolute staggering devastation that climate change is going to bring, by having hybrid cars or something. Don't get me wrong. I drive a hybrid car. Please recycle. That's great. Oh, why not? But the reality is that these are really serious problems, and ones whose a lot of the nightmares that are coming are completely without the ability to even stall to a degree. So people know that. People live in the real world. I think that there is this is a common feature to modern society. Lots of writers, unfortunately, mostly right-wing writers, talk about this underlying anxiety and tension that people have. People do know that, for example, like American society whose consumption is built on the ill-gotten gains of imperialism is unsustainable, that there's really no way to keep a lot of these systems going. And even though like we're facing, staggering inequality in the US, there's still like a global kind of stratification involved. And so I think that these tensions are very, very present in people's lives. And you see them in a lot of the ways that people are starting to build out that participate in crisis. So for example, around the economic crisis, 2007, 2008, you basically had people confronting falling real wages by taking out loans they could never pay back, buying multiple houses, basically living in the now in a way that negates the future because there is no guaranteed future. And there's a lot of kind of examples of this that are kind of accelerating. So can the left use apocalypticism? I mean, for one, I think it has to, because a good left has a real vision for how to solve problems. And to do that, you have to live in the real world. And to not look at a potential apocalypse or a living apocalypse is to not live in a world where you can develop solutions to real problems. I mean, that's just the bottom line. Like, if you think that cap and trade is going to do anything other than slow things by a millisecond, then you're not going to provide anything to the working class. But, I think in a lot of ways, it's easier for me to talk about the U.S. and its kind of Protestant traditions than it is for me to talk about other places, though it's reflected in other countries as well. But there is this kind of millennialist. I am just a bundle of words, but there is this kind of millennialist tradition, millenarian tradition of apocalyptic thinking, of waiting for the apocalypse to come as if it could come at any moment. And this has dotted the American landscape. It has an effect on the politics, and it's especially had an effect on the politics since the 1950s. What I talk about in the book, The Paranoid Style of American Politics. But it goes way back, and it comes back in a lot of ways from the Protestant traditions and Calvinist traditions that formed a lot of the kind of underlying ethical systems that backed up capitalism and the political sphere. But that and because of that, I think we're that's inescapable. I think that thinking is really deep in our culture, and while we should critique it and be involved and certainly not give way to paranoid thinking and conspiracism, we should also think about that as an opportunity to be challenged, because part of the millennial narratives, the apocalyptic narratives, is that there's a crescendo to things. And at the end of them, there is theoretically something positive, right? There's like a messianic conclusion to some of these. So instead, why don't we intervene on that narrative? There's nothing about an apocalypse that's guaranteed. And even in apocalyptic narratives, it's really unclear about how it's going to play out. And it usually plays out in the positive. And so I think instead thinking, how are we actually going to intervene on that? How are we going to embody the best of the apocalyptic tradition? Not to hold it back, not to live in a fantasy world, but to dive headfirst off of it. How do we come like fully loaded with the ability to say, like, no, we're taking this crisis and we're pushing fully to the other side of it so that we can have something new?
I had a question about Portland. Because it kind of fascinates me as like a particular area, because it's got this very progressive image, but of course, Oregon is historically one of the most racist states in the whole of America, and there seems to be something specifically a very distinctive character to that specific Northwest area, with its own kind of like particular balance of forces. There's a very strong anti-fascist presence, of course, but there is this kind of white separatism as well. Mm-hmm. How do you kind of trace that playing out over the past kind of 10 years or so?
I think it actually is a microcosm of the larger dynamic. So Oregon was started as a white ethno-state, basically. It started as an exclusivist white state. And there's many generations of attempts to clear out non-white folks, Chinese exclusion, first generation of the Klan, which was as large here as it was anywhere. Various levels of exclusion that have taken place. Exclusion of Black communities in Vanport and other parts of the city where they're brought in, to work on chips, for example, but then we're, basically put into the worst areas of town and run off. So there's various generations of this happening that plays into a lot of the actual current conditions of the city, which is basically a white gentrified commercial zone, whereby its liberal politics are actually recuperated by its branding, So the progressive political brand really is about selling Portland more than anything else. It's certainly not about inclusion. If you look at any of the neighborhoods that were previously black neighborhoods are now very, very expensive white tech neighborhoods. The same thing that played out in other cities. But I think the dynamics, the actual demographic dynamics, are set up by those earlier conditions and multiple generations of it. And it's maintained by like a particularly pernicious police force and other institutions that have allowed for that. At the same time, though, those politics which are sort of deeply underlaid the social systems are actually on the surface, like just a few minutes outside the city. And I'm not the kind of person that I think it's super inappropriate to throw rural people under the bus as though there's some kind of like racist monolith or something like that. But there is like deep red politics in areas about Oregon. Oregon is a largely rural state. There is a freeway, I-5, that runs through the city, that links up a few cities, that runs through the center of or to the right, to the left of the state, but it links up a few cities. So those urban areas, and then maybe Bend a little bit more east, are deep blue political areas. And then we're talking about areas that are, timber, mining, ranching, farming areas, things like that outside of it. And there's a political tension, obviously, when those blue areas are so removed from the reality of the other areas on the one hand, but then also the political levers are being controlled by cities when the vast majority of the area land mass is not in cooperation with those cities. So there ends up being like a policy disparity that creates a lot of tension and anger. There is an insurgent white supremacist component to this, though, and that, I think it comes back to that blowback in. That tension plays out in very real ways in these areas. So, like, for example, I was talking to my wife about this. Back when I was very young, my dad fought really hard. He was a bus driver, union bus driver. He fought really hard to carry a gun at work. He used to carry a gun at work. All the guys used to carry guns at work. He fought really hard. They lost that. I remember this happening when I was young. But when I got older, I was like, well, why do you do that? He's like, oh, it was the neo-Nazi skinheads. Every day they'd come on the bus and start fights with people. Every park in town, basically, we're talking like big historic parks, Pioneer Courthouse Square, which everyone loves to visit in Portland, filled with neo-Nazi skinheads in the 80s. It was so profound that people felt uncomfortable just walking through the city. This was the kind of a countercultural character of the city. And there's multiple generations that have played out like this. Today, it's less likely to be neo-Nazi skinheads and more likely to be Proud Boys or maybe some other kind of formation. But there's multiple generations of this, and it never went away. So I think that clash continues to play out. And I think Oregon's also very ill-equipped in being able to confront it because it has given into, I guess we could call it, a racial capitalism that has maintained a character of being kind of a white ethno-state that now uses ostensibly anti-racist politics simply to bring in more capital, which then replays the continual story of gentrification and eviction.
What's happening now with the Proud Boys in Oregon and the surrounding area? There were a few clashes a while back, but I don't know much recently. What's going on?
They've had less events recently. There's been some a nearby smaller, I guess it would be like a suburban town, Oregon City, which is near Portland, maybe 20 minutes out. There's been some events there. They've had less, though. There's been a lot of instability in the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys are the definition of an unstable organism that can't. That I think its time is limited. Those people and those ideas and stuff, they go on to something else. But as a formal organizational structure, it's really volatile. And that was incredibly heavy up through the summer. And then through the election, it has quieted down a bit. And this summer, it's been a little quieter than I thought it might be. But yeah, those rallies, those events and stuff continue to happen. They have to find flashpoints, though. Either it's responding to what they call Antifa, which is usually not Antifa, or it's fighting about masks or demasking vaccines, or it's about the election being stolen from Trump, by pedophile Satanists or something. So like it has to have a catalyst, and I think maybe they're just not taking the bait as much. That being said, they still show up pretty regularly, just not with the quite large size and frequency they were for a couple of years.
It's funny with the Proud Boys because whatever happens. Well, this is for general, but whatever happens in America often replicates itself in the UK in a diminished form. And, Proud Boys was such a big thing in America. And here we had a Proud Boys UK for like 2 seconds. And I actually saw a Proud Boy full dressed up in a MAGA hat and the shirt and everything in Doncaster Station when I was coming out on the train and I just kind of did a double take and went on my way. But of course, it's a different thing in America. There's another ghoul who is kind of unique, who came out of Portland. Of course, it's Andy Ngo, who you've kind of had some skirmishes with. You did this kind of quite incredible Twitter thread about his book when it came out, which I was thoroughly entertained by, and I read all the takes on it. How do you think his kind of model of generating kind of outrage and sympathy and then raising money, how kind of sustainable do you think that is? Because we had a similar kind of deal with Tommy Robinson in the UK, where he would like get himself into a big scrape, trump it up, and then raise a lot of money off it and get a lot of attention off it, and then the cycle would start again. And eventually Tommy Robinson had a diminishing returns, he was deplatformed and kind of faded away. Do you think the same thing could happen with Andy Ngo, or has he kind of struck a kind of way of keeping this thing going?
I mean, I think he's more stable than Tommy Robinson. I mean, I think that Tommy Robinson analogy actually works really well for a lot of these figures, but the problem is that Andy Ngo isn't actually involved in activism, so they don't have the in-space component, really. He also uses a little bit more neutral language in a lot of the cases. What would get him deplatformed is if Twitter and other social media make a stance on his use of like mugshots and personal information and tweet threads and stuff. That could be something that pulls it. And I think at a certain point, he does have diminishing fundraising returns. But again, he has a very brilliant grift here. Like, he has taken this Antifa so-called victimization of him to like really catastrophic levels. So like very recently, maybe a few months ago, he showed up at like some anti-fascist or militant rally, dressed up and basically let himself be revealed and then ran away and hid, and then, did a bunch of fundraising around it. These things seem very intentional to me. His book is very shallow in content, but very heavy on his feelings about, the pernicious Antifa threat, lots of claims that can't possibly be verified. Or things that just have no evidence whatsoever. And so I think he has the ability to keep this thing going. That being said, again, one thing I think is important is that there's absolutely no way that people respect Andy Ngo. In his world, strength is important, and he emphatically doesn't have it. Like, that's part of his brand. And so his people only use him in as much as he is useful to them, that he is useful as a symbol of Antifa's, degeneracy or something. So I think that actually makes it hard for them to want to support Andy Ngo in the long term. He's also done a lot of fundraising at this point, and now he's actually trying to make it in a career model as an editor at Post Millennial, which really hasn't taken off. But he has a few secret weapons, one of which is this ongoing litigation where he's trying to sue what he thinks are members of Rose City Antifa, which he thinks has something to do with his assault, none of which makes any sense, none of which has any evidence. And that, I think, actually has a lot more benefits for Andy Ngo than the actual financial components of the lawsuit itself. I think it just allows it to stay in the media cycle. So I think he can keep it going for a while. But unless he kind of changes his tricks, he's not going to be there. And I think like the far-right grifters that have done this well have created enough of an enduring brand that they have been past their single issues, and Andy Ngo has yet to do that. But that doesn't stop him from being incredibly dangerous, even if he's only has another year or two in him. It's with those caveats any longer. And we saw it really clearly during the coronavirus